At 11:47 a.m. on August 14, 1943, Private First Class Tommy Reardon crouched behind a moss-covered log in the dense jungle of New Georgia, Solomon Islands, watching 32 Japanese soldiers advance through the undergrowth toward his isolated position. His M1919 Browning machine gun sat useless beside him, jammed after the third burst, same as it had jammed for 3 other gunners in his company over the past 6 days. In the next 4 minutes, Reardon would violate 3 separate articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, destroy Army property worth $667, and single-handedly break a Japanese assault that had already cost 43 American lives. The weapon he used wouldn't appear in any official after-action report for 7 months. Tommy Reardon grew up in Beckley, West Virginia, where his father worked the coal mines and his uncle ran a timber operation in the Appalachian foothills. At 14, Tommy was helping his uncle clear woodland, learning to improvise solutions when equipment failed miles from the nearest town. When a hydraulic line burst on the log skidder, Tommy rigged a replacement from garden hose and radiator clamps. When the sawmill's conveyor belt snapped, he spliced it back together with piano wire and leather straps. His uncle called it root barn engineering, making do with whatever roots and barn scraps you could find. The Army called it unauthorized modification of equipment. Tommy called it staying alive. The M1919 Browning machine gun was supposed to be reliable. On paper, it fired 400 to 600 rounds per minute, could sustain fire for extended periods, and had served effectively since World War I. In the steaming humidity of the South Pacific, it became a death sentence. The weapon's intricate gas system and multiple moving parts accumulated moisture, dirt, and rust faster than any cleaning routine could address. Gun crews learned to expect failure at the worst possible moments. June 17, 1943. Private Danny Hutchins from Atlanta set up his M1919 on a trail junction near Munda. When the Japanese attacked at dawn, the gun fired 11 rounds before the bolt carrier froze mid-cycle. Hutchins died trying to clear the jam with his bare hands, Japanese bullets stitching across his chest as he yanked at the charging handle. He was 20 years old, June 23rd. Corporal Sam Whitaker from Mobile positioned his gun to cover a river crossing. The weapon fired 2 bursts, then went silent. Extractor claws snapped. Empty brass case lodged in the chamber. Whitaker grabbed his carbine, but caught a grenade fragment in the throat before he could bring it up. He bled out in 4 minutes, while his assistant gunner, Eddie Briggs, watched helplessly. Whitaker had shown Briggs photographs of his daughter that morning. She was 3. July 2nd, Sergeant Mike Dunphy from Chicago Heights set up in a defensive position covering the battalion aid station. His M1919 functioned perfectly during test firing that morning. When Japanese infiltrators hit the perimeter at 2:30 a.m., the gun fired 8 rounds before the feed tray pall broke. Dunphy fought with his .45 pistol and was found the next morning with 7 empty magazines around his body and 13 Japanese dead in front of his position. The Army awarded him a Silver Star posthumously. It didn't mention that his machine gun had killed exactly 0 of those 13 men. Tommy Reardon had known Hutchins. They'd shared cigarettes and talked about opening a garage together back in the States. He'd helped carry Whitaker's body to the aid station, watched Briggs cry silently over his friend. He'd been 20 meters away when Dunphy's gun went quiet, heard the pistol shots that followed, counted them, knew what each silence between shots meant. The problem wasn't maintenance. Every gunner in the company stripped their weapons twice daily, cleaning every surface, oiling every moving part. The humidity laughed at their efforts. Moisture condensed inside the receiver faster than they could wipe it away. The jungle heat expanded metal components just enough to create binding points. Coral dust, finer than talcum powder, infiltrated every seal and crevice. Tommy went to Lieutenant Packard after Dunphy died. "Sir, the guns aren't reliable. The humidity's getting into the gas system and the feed mechanism. We need to..." "The M1919 is an approved Army weapon, Private. It's performed admirably in every theater." Packard was from Connecticut, 3 months out of officer candidate school. "If you're experiencing malfunctions, improve your cleaning regimen." "Sir, we're cleaning them constantly. The problem is the design. In this climate, all those small parts..." "The weapon is within specifications, Reardon." Dismissed. 2 days later, a supply sergeant from battalion showed them a technical bulletin about M1919 maintenance in tropical environments. It recommended more frequent cleaning and lubrication with different grades of oil. Tommy read it twice, then set it aside. They were already doing everything the bulletin suggested. The bulletin had been written by men who'd never spent a night in a jungle where your rifle stock swelled from humidity and your bootlaces rotted in 3 days. The moral calculation was simple and terrible. Following regulations meant watching more men die when their weapons failed. Breaking regulations meant court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison time. Tommy thought about Hutchins dying with his hands inside the receiver of a jammed gun. He thought about opening a garage in Beckley that would never exist because Hutchins was buried somewhere in the jungle with a wooden marker. He thought about his uncle's advice. "When the manual don't work, Tommy, you make what does." August 11th, 1943, at 11:20 p.m., Tommy sat in the darkness near the company supply dump. His M19E19 disassembled on a poncho in front of him. The jungle hummed with insects. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. His hands were steady. The problem was complexity. Too many parts, too many surfaces requiring perfect alignment. The gas system had 7 separate components that had to function in precise sequence. The feed mechanism had 11 moving parts. Each interface point was a potential failure. Tommy couldn't redesign the weapon. That was beyond him, but he could simplify it. He started with the gas regulator, the part that controlled how much gas pressure drove the bolt carrier. The standard regulator had 3 settings and required a specialized tool to adjust. Tommy used his bayonet to remove it entirely, then took a .30 caliber cartridge case and hammered it flat. He drilled a single hole through the flattened brass, larger than any of the regulator's settings, and fitted it into the gas port. More gas pressure meant more violent action, harder cycling. It also meant the weapon would wear out faster and possibly damage itself. He didn't care about longevity. He cared about the next firefight. The feed mechanism was trickier. The standard system used a pawl and cam arrangement to pull the ammunition belt through the gun. Tommy removed the return spring, the part that reset the pawl for the next round, and replaced it with a heavier spring scavenged from a damaged carbine. The increased tension slammed the pawl forward harder, reducing the chance of moisture or dirt causing a feeding failure. He cut 3/8" off the pawl's engaging surface to reduce friction points. His thumb was bleeding from where he'd slipped with the hacksaw. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the weapon's receiver. He worked by the light of a hooded flashlight, aware that any officer walking past would see enough to justify charges. The modified gas system would create dangerous overpressure. The altered feed mechanism violated tolerance specifications. The removed safety features could cause catastrophic failure. At 1:15 a.m., he reassembled the weapon. The modified components fit, but barely. The bolt cycled with a harsher, more aggressive sound. He'd essentially turned a precision machine gun into a crude automatic weapon that prioritized function over longevity. If it worked, it would probably destroy itself within a few thousand rounds. If it failed, the overpressure could rupture the barrel or receiver, possibly killing him. He sat there in the darkness, holding the weapon, thinking about Packard's warning about unauthorized modifications. Court-martial meant disgrace, prison, his mother learning her son was a criminal. Then he thought about Briggs, crying over Whitaker's body, about Hutchins, never getting to open that garage, about the next gunner, who would die because his weapon failed when he needed it most. Tommy wrapped the modified M1919 in canvas and hid it under his bunk. He said nothing to anyone. August 14th, 1943, at 6:30 a.m., the company moved out on a patrol toward suspected Japanese positions near Barike. Tommy carried his standard issue M1919, clean and properly maintained, and utterly unreliable. The modified weapon remained hidden back at camp. He told himself he'd been stupid, that he couldn't risk the court-martial, that following orders was the right choice. At 9:15 a.m., the patrol's point element made contact. Japanese forces in unknown strength dug into positions along a ridgeline. Captain Hayes ordered the company to establish a defensive line and called for artillery support. Tommy's squad was positioned on the left flank, covering an approach through dense undergrowth. At 10:30 a.m., Private Johnny Vickers, 21, from Sacramento, wanted to be a teacher, set up his M1919 30 meters to Tommy's right. When the Japanese probed the line, Vickers' gun fired 4 rounds before jamming. He was killed trying to transition to his rifle. Tommy heard the single shot that ended it, heard Vickers' assistant gunner screaming for a medic. Tommy looked at his own M1919, freshly cleaned that morning, ready to fail when he needed it. He looked at Vickers being dragged back from his position, blood soaking through the medic's hands. He stood up. "Where you going?" his assistant gunner asked. "Back to camp. My barrel's overheating." It was a lie. Tommy moved fast through the jungle, low and quiet, adrenaline making everything sharp and clear. He was back at the defensive line by 11:35 a.m. with the modified weapon. Nobody questioned him. Barrel changes were common enough. He set up behind a thick log, fed a fresh belt of ammunition, chambered the first round. The weapon felt different in his hands, heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. At 11:47 a.m., 32 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle 120 meters downslope. They moved in 2 groups, using fire and maneuver tactics, advancing on Tommy's isolated position while the rest of the American line was engaged elsewhere. Tommy was alone except for his assistant gunner, a replacement who'd arrived 3 days earlier and whose name Tommy couldn't remember in that moment. The Japanese hadn't seen him yet. They were advancing toward what they thought was an unmanned section of line. Tommy pressed his shoulder into the buttstock, aligned the sights on the lead group, and pressed the trigger. The gun roared. The sound was different, harsher, more violent than a standard M1919. The bolt cycled so fast it blurred. Brass cases ejected in a golden stream. The weapon shuddered in Tommy's grip, like something alive and angry. The lead group went down. Not all of them, not at first, but enough to break their momentum. Tommy traversed right. The gun kept firing. No hesitation, no stutter, just a continuous tearing sound that echoed across the jungle. The second group scattered, some diving for cover, others freezing in the open. Tommy adjusted his aim and fired into them. A Japanese light machine gun opened up from Tommy's left. Tracers snapped past his head. Bullets thudded into the log in front of him. His assistant gunner was yelling something Tommy couldn't hear over the weapon's roar. Tommy shifted his point of aim, walked his fire toward the muzzle flashes. The enemy gun went silent. The modified M1919 was cooking now, heat waves rising from the barrel, the handguard too hot to touch. The overpressure Tommy had deliberately created was cycling the action so violently that empty cases were flying 10 feet to his right. The weapon was probably destroying itself with every round, wearing away tolerance surfaces, creating stress fractures in the receiver. He didn't stop firing. More Japanese emerged from cover, trying to flank. Tommy caught them moving, swung the gun left, fired a sustained burst that lasted 8 seconds. The modified feed mechanism slammed rounds through without pause. In standard configuration, the M1919 might have jammed by now. Moisture, dirt, something. The crude modifications didn't give failure a chance to develop. The weapon cycled too hard, too fast, too violently for anything to bind. A grenade exploded 15 meters to Tommy's front. Dirt showered across his position. His ears were ringing. The assistant gunner was pulling on his shoulder, pointing to the right where more Japanese were advancing. Tommy traversed, found targets, fired. The weapon bucked in his grip. His shoulder would be bruised black by tomorrow, if he lived that long. 4 minutes since the engagement started. The jungle in front of Tommy's position was eerily quiet. Smoke drifted between the trees. The modified M1919 ticked and pinged as metal cooled. Tommy's hands were shaking. He'd fired 347 rounds. He knew because 3 belts were empty beside him, and the 4th was half expended. The barrel was probably warped. The receiver was definitely damaged. He might never be able to fire the weapon again. 32 bodies lay scattered on the slope below his position. He hadn't counted them yet, didn't want to. But they were there in groups and individually, marking the path of his fire. Some were moving, wounded, and he felt sick about that, but also grimly satisfied, because wounded men would withdraw, tell their commanders that this section of the American line was death. "Jesus Christ," the assistant gunner said. "Jesus Christ, Reardon." Tommy said nothing. His ears rang. The weapon in front of him looked wrong. Metal discolored by heat, parts visibly out of alignment. Anyone with mechanical knowledge could see it had been modified. Anyone with authority could have him arrested. At 11:58 a.m., Sergeant Bill Hughes appeared at Tommy's position, moving fast through the jungle. Hughes was 34, from Kansas City, had fought in the Guadalcanal campaign, and carried shrapnel in his left leg that hurt when it rained. He looked at the bodies on the slope, looked at Tommy's weapon, looked at Tommy. "That's not a standard M1919. Tommy met his eyes. "No, Sergeant. That's unauthorized modification of Army equipment." "Yes, Sergeant." Hughes knelt, examined the weapon without touching it. His face was unreadable. "How long has it been modified?" 3 days. "And you didn't report it?" "No, Sergeant." The silence stretched. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Someone was yelling for a medic on another section of the line. Hughes looked at the bodies again, then back at Tommy. "When we get back to camp," Hughes said slowly, "you're going to show me exactly what you did to this weapon. Every modification, every change. Understood?" Tommy understood. Hughes was going to document everything. Build the case for court-martial. "Yes, Sergeant." "Because," Hughes continued, "every gunner in this company is going to make the same modifications tonight, and I want them done right." Tommy stared at him. "Sergeant?" "Vickers is dead. Hutchins, Whitaker, Dunphy, all dead because their guns failed. You just killed 32 enemy soldiers with a weapon that didn't fail." Hughes stood up. "I don't care what the manual says. I care about my men coming home. Now get that gun cleaned up and back to camp. We've got work to do." By 8 p.m. that evening, 7 M1919 machine guns in Easy Company had been modified according to Tommy's specifications. Sergeant Hughes supervised personally, writing down each step, measuring each modification. The work was done quietly, without Lieutenant Packard's knowledge. The modified weapons were marked with a small notch filed into the receiver, invisible unless you knew to look for it, but enough that every gunner could identify his weapon. By the next morning, 2 other sergeants had heard about it. They appeared at Hughes's tent, asking questions. Hughes showed them Vickers' death report, showed them the maintenance logs documenting M1919 failures, showed them the after-action report from Tommy's engagement. The sergeants listened, nodded, and went back to their own companies. By evening, 4 more machine guns had been modified. Lieutenant Packard noticed on August 17th when he inspected Easy Company's weapons. The modifications were too obvious to hide. The altered gas ports, the modified feed mechanisms, the missing standard components. Packard stared at Tommy's weapon for 30 seconds, his face reddening. "Who authorized this?" "I did, sir," Hughes said, "after Private Reardon's action on the 14th. This is unauthorized modification of Army property, Sergeant. These weapons are out of specification. They could be dangerous." "Yes, sir. They're very dangerous. To the enemy." Packard's jaw worked. "I'm writing this up. Charges will be filed." "With respect, sir, you might want to wait on that." Hughes handed him a report. "Captain Hayes wants all machine guns in the battalion modified using Reardon's specifications. The colonel saw our after-action reports and is considering it for the entire regiment." Packard read the report twice. His hand trembled slightly. "This is irregular." "Yes, sir. So is winning." The formal investigation began on August 20th. A captain from Battalion Ordnance arrived to examine the modified weapons and interview witnesses. Tommy sat in a tent and answered questions for 2 hours, expecting each answer to seal his court-martial. The ordnance captain took notes, asked for demonstrations, had Tommy modify an unaltered M1919 while he watched. "You understand," the captain said, "that these modifications void all safety tolerances. The overpressure could cause catastrophic failure." "Yes, sir." "The weapon's service life is probably reduced by 75%. "Yes, sir." "And you did this anyway." "Men were dying, sir. Their guns were failing." The captain was quiet for a long time. "How many enemy did you kill with this weapon?" 32 confirmed, sir. 4 probables." "In 4 minutes?" "Yes, sir." "And the weapon didn't jam?" "No, sir." The captain closed his notebook. "You're probably going to be court-martialed, Private. What you did violates at least 3 articles. But between you and me, I hope they give you a medal instead." The report sat on desks for 3 weeks. During that time, M1919 failures in the Solomon Islands dropped from 17 documented cases per month to 2. Both failures occurred with unmodified weapons. 63 machine guns were modified using Tommy's specifications, unofficially, without written orders, through a network of sergeants and armorers who passed instructions verbally and demonstrated techniques in the darkness. Japanese forces in the region began reporting encounters with American machine guns that fired faster and more reliably than previous engagements. A captured diary from a Japanese officer on New Georgia mentioned, "The American automatic weapons have improved in function and recommended increased caution when assaulting American positions." Another entry, dated September 3rd, described an attack where the American machine gun did not stop firing until 20 of our men were casualties. On September 12, 1943, a lieutenant colonel from Army Ground Forces arrived at Munda Airfield. His name was Robert Marsh, and he'd been sent from Hawaii specifically to investigate the unauthorized modifications spreading through the theater. Tommy was confined to camp, waiting for formal charges. Marsh interviewed 15 soldiers, examined 20 modified weapons, and reviewed every after-action report from August and September. On September 15th, he submitted his findings to Theater Command. The report was classified, but its conclusions filtered down through the chain of command. The modifications developed by PFC Reardon represent practical solutions to environmental challenges not addressed in standard maintenance protocols. While technically unauthorized, the modifications have demonstrably improved weapon reliability in tropical conditions, recommend formal engineering evaluation, and possible integration into official specifications. The court-martial never came. Instead, on September 28th, Tommy was promoted to corporal and assigned to battalion headquarters as an armorer. His job was to train other armorers in the modification techniques, supervise their implementation, and document results. He spent the rest of 1943 traveling between companies, showing mechanics and armorers how to modify their weapons, answering questions, refining the techniques. By December 1943, the modifications had spread to units across the South Pacific. A technical bulletin was issued, not ordering the modifications, but describing them as field expedient improvements permissible at unit commander discretion in tropical environments. The bulletin didn't mention Tommy's name. Official credit was attributed to enlisted personnel in the field developing practical solutions to environmental challenges. The modified weapons acquired a nickname Root Barns, borrowed from Tommy's West Virginia term for improvised engineering. The name spread faster than the modifications themselves. When a gun crew talked about their root barn rig, everyone knew what they meant. An M19 that would fire when you needed it to fire, that wouldn't fail in the middle of a firefight, that might destroy itself eventually, but would take enemy soldiers down first. January 1944. A formal engineering evaluation was conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Army engineers tested modified M19 Mundines against standard configurations in simulated tropical conditions. The modified weapons showed 47% fewer malfunctions, over 10,000 rounds, despite displaying 68% increased component wear. The engineering report concluded, while modifications reduce weapon longevity, they substantially improve reliability in adverse conditions. The trade-off may be acceptable in theaters where logistical support allows for increased replacement of worn components. The report recommended further study. It did not recommend immediate implementation. Bureaucracy moved slowly, even when soldiers were dying. In the Pacific, nobody waited for bureaucracy. By March 1944, an estimated 400 M19E19 machine guns had been modified using Tommy's techniques. The modifications appeared in official records only as maintenance notes. Gas system serviced, feed mechanism adjusted, components replaced per field evaluation. Officers who understood what was happening looked the other way. Officers who didn't understand couldn't figure out why their weapons suddenly worked better. Tommy's service record from this period is bare of decorations. No medals, no commendations, just the single promotion to corporal and a notation, assigned armorer duties battalion level. He requested transfer back to a line company 3 times. Each request was denied. The Army had finally figured out he was more valuable teaching others than fighting himself. April 1945. Tommy Reardon rotated back to the United States, his enlistment complete. He'd spent 22 months in the Pacific, modified more than 200 machine guns personally, and trained 43 armorers in the techniques. His service record showed no combat decorations, no Purple Heart, no recognition beyond that single promotion. When he boarded the transport ship in Manila, nobody saluted, nobody made speeches. He was just another enlisted man going home. He returned to Beckley in May 1945, 2 weeks before VE Day. His uncle's timber operation had expanded during the war. They needed mechanics. Tommy went to work maintaining log skidders and sawmill equipment, using the same root barn engineering he'd learned as a teenager. He married a girl from Sofia named Marie in 1947. They had 3 children. Tommy never talked much about the war. When other veterans gathered at the VFW hall, swapping stories and drinking cheap beer, Tommy mostly listened. If someone asked directly about his service, he'd say he was an armorer in the Pacific, nothing special. The one time someone pressed for details, a younger veteran, Korea, impressed by Tommy's ribbons, Tommy said, "I fixed broken guns. That's all." He died in 1987, age 64, of heart failure. His obituary in the Beckley Register-Herald was 3 paragraphs. The second paragraph mentioned his military service. Corporal Reardon served with distinction in the South Pacific during World War II as an armorer with the 37th Infantry Division. It didn't mention the modifications, the 32 Japanese soldiers, the court-martial that never came, or the hundreds of weapons he'd altered. The Army's official history of small arms in World War II, published in 1988, includes 1 paragraph about field modifications to the M1919 in the Pacific Theater. It attributes the modifications to enlisted maintenance personnel, developing practical solutions to environmental challenges, and notes that the modifications informed post-war weapon development and tropical warfare doctrine. Tommy Reardon's name doesn't appear. But in the archives of the 37th Infantry Division Association, there's a letter written by Sergeant Bill Hughes in 1973. Hughes was responding to a researcher's questions about weapon modifications in the Solomon Islands. The letter is 4 pages long, typewritten, and it describes in detail what Tommy Reardon did on August 11, 1943, and in the months that followed. The final paragraph reads, "We lost a lot of good men in those islands, some to enemy action, some to disease, some to equipment that failed when it mattered most. Tommy Reardon broke the rules to make sure fewer men died from that last category. The Army didn't court-martial him, didn't give him a medal, didn't officially acknowledge what he did. But every gunner who carried a root barn rig knew. Every soldier who lived because his machine gun didn't jam knew. The official records can say whatever they want. Tommy Reardon saved lives, and we knew it. That's how progress actually happens in war. Not through engineering committees in Maryland, not through technical bulletins written by officers who've never heard a weapon jam when enemy soldiers are 30 meters away. Progress happens through enlisted men who watch their friends die, who understand machines better than regulations, who are willing to risk court-martial because they've decided that saving lives matters more than following rules. The M1919 served through the Korean War and into the early years of Vietnam. Later versions incorporated improved gas systems and feed mechanisms that bore striking similarity to Tommy's modifications, though official Army documentation never acknowledged the connection. The weapon's reliability in adverse conditions improved substantially in post-war variants. Combat veterans who'd carried both versions knew the difference, knew where those improvements had originated, even if the paperwork didn't. Tommy Reardon is buried in Blue Ridge Memorial Gardens outside Beckley. His headstone is standard military issue. Name, rank, dates of service, a small cross. Nothing distinguishes it from thousands of other veterans' graves, except for what it doesn't say. Doesn't mention the innovation, doesn't mention the lives saved, doesn't mention that sometimes the most important military advances come from West Virginia coal country, from men who learned root barn engineering before they ever wore a uniform. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.